Hey guys, welcome back to this journey on Becoming Five. You know that the Becoming Five language was developed to help churches think about the spectrum of multiplication and to think about their relative position on this journey from subtraction to multiplication. My name is Dave Rhodes. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit more about Becoming Five and to really think through a biblical foundation or layover of this level 5 journey. As you learned about in your last session, we were talking about 3 different levels of churches that are in subtraction, churches that are in addition, churches that are in multiplication, and the 2 transitional levels that come between those 3 primary levels. To think through this, we're put the circles back up on the board, talking about level 1 being in subtraction, level 3 addition, level 5 multiplication. The 2 transitional levels between subtraction and addition is that of surviving or plateauing, depending on which way you're going about it. And then the journey from addition to subtraction is the level of reproducing. Now, as we think a little bit further on this journey, we could talk about the language that is coming out of different levels of churches. This is language that was developed in the exponential learning communities that I think might be helpful in helping us think about this journey. So the language that's coming out of a subtraction church is the language of please stay. Everyone else is leaving. Please don't you leave too. Please stay. Be part of this thing. Don't abandon us. Don't leave us. The language coming out of an addition level church is the language of please come, meaning God's doing some incredible things here. We're growing. We want more and more people to be part of that. Again, we're not being critical of that. We're not saying that that's inaccurate. We're just suggesting that maybe it's inadequate in really accomplishing the things of multiplication that God's placed on our heart. Because the language is all about please come to us, and it's not about releasing the people of God. Which is why the language around multiplication is the language of please go. And as we've seen previously, as we talk about this level 5 journey, we see 2 major magnetic pulls that are part of this journey. The first pull is the pull from level 1 to level 3. So that we think if we can just get to addition, everything will be fine. Since most churches are in subtraction, they come to a conference, they see a mega church do something phenomenal thing. If we could just get there, if we could just get to addition, if we could just grow again, everything would be great. Magnetic pull in that direction. But we also saw that there's a magnetic pull back in the opposite direction. That as you begin to reproduce and move toward multiplication, there's a magnetic pull back toward addition. That as you begin to release and go, sometimes that there is a reversion back to just want to stay in the land of addition. Today, we want to go a little bit further in explanation of these things and overlay this journey with a biblical framework. It's not the only place to see this in the Bible. It's not even an exhaustive place to see it in the Bible, but hopefully it'll be a helpful place to overlay this journey, especially this journey from level 3 to level 5, that might be incredibly helpful for us as leaders as we think about making this journey personally and as we think about making this journey as part of our church. So in that capacity, we have to start in Genesis 1 and 2, where God's first command to his people is to increase and multiply. He says, I want you to make a family. I want that family to be on mission, and I want it to be multiplying to where it fills the entire earth. That from the very beginning, when God creates Adam and Eve, the command that he gives them is go and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. This is the Genesis 1-2 Eden dream that God is creating a family, that family is on mission and multiplying all over the world. Genesis 3 happens where the family gets broken and the mission gets broken. Genesis chapter 3 through 6 is the story of humanity just spiraling out of control. So much so that in Genesis chapter 6, God sends a flood that destroys everything. But the first thing God comes back and says to Noah is this: I want you to increase and multiply. In other words, on the back end of Genesis 3, God still hasn't given up on his Genesis 1-2 dream, that he wants people to increase and multiply, to create family that's on mission together and is multiplying all over the planet. It's the same kind of thing that I would suggest to you on the back end of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, where Genesis chapter 12 introduces us to a guy named Abram that stands in the background of this conversation of God and Abram. When God says to Abram, Abram, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Genesis 12 through 15, there's this incredible conversation. That in back of that, God's saying, I still haven't given up on my Genesis 1-2 dream, Abram, and I want that multiplication to start with you. I would also suggest that it's this kind of language that sits in the background of Jesus and his followers when in Matthew 28 he looks at them and says, I want you guys to make disciples of all nations. That in the back of that sits this Genesis 1 and 2 command to go and to increase and multiply. Now, for the believers across the Old Testament, the challenge wasn't necessarily hearing the command. It was in putting that command into practice. It wasn't that they disagreed with it. It's just that that command came in the middle of a world where there were forces trying to keep this people from multiplying. All throughout the Old Testament, you see the forces of barrenness and genocide, the forces of famine and captivity that long to keep the people of God out of this multiplication kind of mindset. And so the journey we're talking about today, as we just kind of think about this journey, is the journey of the people of God from the land of Egypt, which I would suggest is a land that becomes a land of subtraction, to the promised land, which God continues to say has everything that you need in it to do the things that I've placed in your heart to do, to become a people that is a family on mission, that is multiplying. The promised land has everything they need in it for multiplication. Now remember, when the story starts in Egypt, the people of God are there and they are reproducing. They're multiplying in Egypt, which just reminds us God is capable of taking even Egypt and turning it into the promised land. That's the story of Joseph. They're there in Egypt, they're reproducing, they're multiplying. But a Pharaoh comes on the scene and creates a genocide of sorts that takes the people of Israel out of multiplication and back into subtraction. Now, the story of Joseph is that God can take Egypt and make it the promised land. The story of Judges, that stands on the back end of this metaphor and this journey, is the story of Israel taking the promised land and turning it into Egypt, which means that, we can even take the promised land and turn it into Egypt. But between those two things is this journey from Egypt to the promised land. And it's a journey that I would suggest we all have to make, and lays at the foundation of this idea of becoming a multiplying community. So Israel starts in Egypt in subtraction on the back end of genocide. And it's Moses who comes to the people of God and says, God wants to bring you to this good and plentiful land. He picks up the specific language of Eden, this good and plentiful land. That's the language of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2. Says God wants to take you out of Egypt back to a land that is Eden-esque, a promised land in which you can increase and multiply. But on this journey between Eden and the promised land, there are two bodies of water that Israel has to cross. The first body of water is called the Red Sea. And this is the sea of survival, of surviving. People of God are in decline, they're in subtraction, and Moses says that God is coming to Pharaoh saying, let my people go. Moses gets the people on their way out of Egypt. They immediately come up against the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is chasing them down from behind. If God doesn't come through in this moment, the people of God are sunk. And it's in this moment that Moses holds up his staff and God parts the sea. And As God parts the sea, the people of God walk through on dry ground. It's an incredible inflection point moment. Not only do they survive, but I would suggest to you, in the wilderness, several important things happen to the people of God that are centralizing forces for them in years to come. One, it's on the back end of the Red Sea that they get the law. Incredibly important piece for them becoming a nation. Two, they become a nation. They go from a people of slaves to becoming one nation. Three, they get the tabernacle, another centralizing structure that is important for them becoming the nation that God is calling them to be. So it's in the desert that they become one nation, that they get the law, they get the tabernacle. Jethro institutes with Moses a way of judging the people. Israel has some significant things that happen to them in this land of addition. The question for Israel, though, is not will they get to addition. The question is, will they get beyond it? And this is the question about whether they're going to go beyond the desert to the promised land. And to get through the desert to the promised land, there's a second body of water that they have to cross. And the second body of water is the Jordan River. And this is the body of water that allows them to be a reproducing and multiplying people. It's an increase of faith moment. Remember, they've been in the desert, they've become one people, they've got the law, and now they're coming to the edge of the promised land, and the first thing that happens, they send some spies into the promised land, the land of multiplication, and the thing the spies come back with is there's giants in those lands. In other words, there's people that don't want us to be there, and you can just feel the reversion of Israel backward from the promised land. So they see the potential. They say it is good and plentiful. It has everything that God said He would have in it. There's a part of their heart that wants to move into it. But there's this other part that is seeing giants and saying, I'm not sure we can take it. Here's why that happens. In moving from 1 to 3, Israel is running away from the land of oppression. In the journey from 3 to 5, they're running back into the land of oppression. So in 1 through 3, they're running away from something, but in 3 to 5, they're running into something. Sometimes it's easier to run away from things than it is to run into things. But we actually have a word that we use for people who run into things, don't we? We call them heroes, people who run into burning buildings, people who run into places that other people are running away from. This is the heroic journey. And it's the journey of the people of God to say, will we be content to stay one nation in the wilderness, or will we dare to journey with God to all the potential of multiplication that God has for us? Now, it's not just the giants that are huge for Israel in this moment. As they cross the Jordan River, several decentralizing factors come into play for Israel. Because now, on the post end of the Jordan River, which, by the way, takes an increase of faith, because at the Red Sea, Moses holds up the staff and they walk through on dry land. At the Jordan River, the priests have to get into the water and the water parts below their feet. That is such the experience of reproduction. One is, the Red Sea, one leader holding up the staff and everyone following. But in the Jordan River, it's as we walk, as we get into the water, that the water begins to part below our feet. But for Israel now, as they move into the promised land comes with all kinds of complications. Because now they're not just one people, one nation in the desert. They've got to learn how to become 12 tribes to rule and to reign this land. And the question for them is, how does the law work in the middle of that? How do we judge and do lawsuits or different things that come up in the middle of that? How do we do the tabernacle in the middle of that? And eventually, how do we do the temple? Because not everyone can get to the temple from where they're living at. So how are we going to do this decentralized thing, not just this centralized thing? And this is the journey for us. At level 3, we learn the centralized skills that are important in us becoming one nation. But as we move from addition to multiplication, sometimes those skills that we learned in addition actually are the exact barriers that stand in the way of multiplication. Because in multiplication, not only are we trying to be one nation, but we're trying to figure out how to become 12 tribes. How do we become places that are in, how to become a nation that's in multiple places? And how do we function as family in the middle of that? How does the law work in the middle of that? How do the systems work in the middle? It creates all kinds of complications. But it also creates all kinds of opportunities. The question for us is this: will we dare to be heroic and to charge into things that other people would shrink away? Or will we settle for something less than God's best? Again, this is not a critique of addition. It's not that addition is inaccurate. We're just suggesting that God's got a bigger dream. It's not that it's inaccurate. It's just inadequate. Because God has always been about his people multiplying. And for that to happen, we not only got to face the giants, we got to walk across the river, we got to learn that sometimes our centralized structures need to embrace decentralization so that we can move from just simply being one nation to 12 tribes, or in our language, so that we can be the church, not just in one place, but in many places, going to every nook and cranny of society and seeing the people of God multiply in that place, because the people of God were not afraid of the giants, and they weren't afraid of a little bit of mess to move from addition to multiplication. So that's the journey. Again, the issue for Israel throughout the Old Testament is not just getting to the promised land, but learning to live in it. And this is going to be our journey too. Like I said earlier, God's capable of taking Egypt and turning it into the promised land. We're capable of taking even the promised land and turning it back into Egypt. This is a continual journey for us. It is one where we will continue to face giants. It is one where we will continue to have to deal with issues. But the promise, or the opportunity for us, is to deal with those things as heroes. So my challenge for you today is this: become the hero that God has called you to be. Don't settle for anything less than God's best, stuck on the edge of the promised land. Let's not spend 40 years walking around in the desert. Let's dare to walk across the Jordan. Let the waters part below our feet. And let's dare to become the people of God that we were always destined to be. Let's multiply. Thank you very much.